Hello and welcome. It's Karen Voller here, Chief Joy Bringer from Evolution, and welcome to our Amazing Leader series. I have another segment here with a wonderful and amazing communications expert. Her name is Petra von Rohr, and she has a background basically starting in the financial world as an analyst and stockbroker in London, and then has moved on from the financial market into PR strategy, brand, and communications. And she worked her way up, became a CEO of an investment bank in Sweden, and then was also CEO for one of the largest PR firms in the world for Sweden. And she has this very unique background of both the financial, working extensively with that, but then also working within communications, consulting. She's been consulting with many of the top international Fortune 500 companies, and is now embarking into a new operational role, basically going back into operations. But she's a pretty amazing person, and I'd just like to welcome Petra here. Thank you for coming, Petra.
Thank you for a fantastic intro. Thank you. I'm so glad to be here.
So, given your background and being the amazing person that you are, I am curious to know what you would say has changed in the world of communications over the last few years.
I mean, a lot of things have changed, of course, but I think the most obvious big change is the speed. I mean, communications is just so fast these days. You can communicate so rapidly. You reach many people very rapidly. And the other change is the transparency, I think, the possibility of looking into companies and really seeing what's going on for all kind of key stakeholders, I would say, are the big two shifts that companies need to manage.
Mm-hmm. So there's been this need for authenticity and transparency. It's coming in the market. How are companies working with this? I mean, how is that changing the ways that they are communicating?
First, I think we have to sort of agree what is trust, and I see that as both as a logical and an emotional act. It's both based on innovation, numbers, market leadership, management, things like that, logical things. You need to deliver on that to achieve trust, but you also have the sort of engagement-based behavioral aspects of it. So, for a company being able to prove that you actually put your clients ahead of profits, that you have a good philosophy towards your employees, that you have principles that people really like and think are okay. And it also takes a long time to build trust. It's not something you fix quickly. However, losing trust or destroying trust, that's something that you can destroy very, very quickly.
Well, we've seen lots of examples of that, unfortunately. And you're right, it does take a long time to build the trust and to keep it. And I think, there's probably a lot of pressure on leaders right now, too, in terms of making sure everything that they're doing is going to work well with the public or the market.
Exactly.
What would you say, what are some things that leaders can do in terms of how they act or how they communicate to build trust within an organization? What can they do there?
Well, I think it's much more pressure on leaders today than it used to be, because there's so much more on the stage all the time. And it's not enough to say the right things, it's also how you say it. The way if you look like you really believe in what you're saying or not, makes a big difference. So training in front of the camera becomes more and more important, but also being able to be yourself, because if you train too much and if you become some kind of robot doing the exact right things, people will see that. So it really has to do with being yourself, but you also need to believe in what you're saying. And that takes training to get that through to an audience, but that needs to be done.
Interesting. Let's shift a little bit here, because I know that I'm very passionate about purpose, and I know that we've had lots of conversations before about purpose, basically. Why do you think purpose matters for companies?
That's a very important part of the trust issue, or the trust topic, because I mean, if you ask a manager 10 years ago, what's the purpose of your company? Why are you doing what you're doing? Well, it's because we're going to maximize the profits for our shareholders. Of course, that's the purpose. That's why we're here. If you ask managers that question today, I think very few people would say that. Now they need to communicate something beyond that, because maximizing profits and giving profits to your shareholders, you need to do that. But it's like air for a human being. You need it, but it's not your purpose of life. And to really get people engaged in a company, as a client, as all stakeholders, employees first and foremost, you really need to be able to tell the world why you're here and how you make things better in this world. And every company has that, but you just need to find it. And you can also see on studies that we're doing and studies that we see abroad and in Sweden, is that those companies that are actually able to communicate and illustrate their corporate purpose and communicate that, they're more profitable and more successful than companies that cannot do that. So it's not a nice to have, it's a need to have.
I think it's a trend that's coming. Not everybody is totally on that train yet, but we need more and more companies understanding that. How have you seen this need for purpose in communication? How has that changed?
I think I work a lot with issue management and crisis communications, and so when trust is at stake, or it is sort of you're losing a little bit of trust, then it becomes even more important to come back to that. Why are we in this world? Why do we do this? It's so much easier to both make stakeholders believe in you and what you do, if you're very clear on what's your corporate purpose.
And are there specific strategies that you would say most companies, I mean, I'm sure it's probably different for every company, but that most companies probably should be looking at or working with?
I think people are still, I mean, managers are still, they're not really there yet. I think most managers realize that you need to do this, and you need to make sure that you're very clear on this. You need to have it communicated, you need to have the stories, but they don't know really how to get there. But I think when you're in a situation when it's difficult, when you have an issue or a crisis, then everything is put at stake, and then you really have to go into the reasons and the whys.
Isn't it better to be proactive before you get to crisis mode?
Absolutely, of course it is, and it's so much easier to prevent crisis and issues if you're clear on these things. And but sometimes you need to be put in a big trouble before you actually do it.
And what about, I mean, just curious, as we're talking with technology, it's changed so much. I think that's really had a huge impact on the communications area of companies and what they're doing. What would you say have been the biggest impacts from that?
I mean, of course, that has changed everything. I mean, everyone communicates with each other, so it's much more difficult for managers and for companies to understand the stakeholder arena. Years ago, it was quite easy. Which were the media, which were the opinion leaders, which were the decision makers in that industry. Now, I mean, it's impossible to do a stakeholder arena that is accurate more than a few minutes. And of course, that's a lot more complicated to handle. But there are tools, but it's not easy.
A lot of challenges there, huh?
And I think a big implication of that is that it becomes even more important to speak with one voice and be consistent in terms of messages. You can't communicate one thing to that person or that stakeholder, and another thing to someone else. It's really, really important to have that one message, one voice.
So in our book, Engage, we talk about these 5 cultural keys, which are collaboration, creativity, connection, celebration, and contribution. Connection is what we talk a lot about, how you communicate both internally and externally. And where do you see that companies in general now are missing in their communications, internally or externally?
I think that something that is really left behind in quite a few organizations is the internal communications. And that's a missed opportunity, because your employees they're the most important channel for communications. And not having your employees on top of things, engaged, totally with you on your corporate purpose, that's such a waste. And that we see in quite a few companies, I would say.
That's interesting. We often talk about the employees being ambassadors for the company, both because they're out, saying whether they like to work at that company or not.
Exactly.
Just that little bit can spread a lot in terms of positive or negative communications about the company. So when we're looking at the employee brand, basically that seems to be taking center stage over the employer brand, where it's being driven by the employees and taking a look from the employee perspective. How can internal communications basically create a structure, develop it, and lead in building these brand ambassadors from within the organization?
I think we come back to corporate purpose here, because if we're clear on that, and if all the people that work in this organization really feels that this purpose is important, I'm out on a mission, and I'm part of this this group of people that will deliver this to the world, it's gonna be so much easier. Everything is gonna be so much easier because everyone has its role to accomplish this corporate purpose. So I think that's very, very key to have that and to have all employees
behind it.
Behind it, exactly.
Talking about these internal champions in the company, how can they become champions for developing the culture? If we're talking about the internal communications and the employees being your kind of the heroes or the ambassadors or whatever you want to call them, how can companies leverage that to create and develop their culture?
Yeah, I think we're coming back a little bit to your 5 cultural keys there. It's about celebrating, because that's a very good way of communicating stories that are illustrating what you're trying to do in this company. If you have the corporate purpose well defined and you have all these stories that illustrate this purpose, then of course you'll find these stories among the employees, and celebrating them is a very good way of communicating.
You're leading into my next question beautifully here, because I've written, how can the employees leverage the storytelling that differentiates them from other companies out there?
But that's that's a little bit up to management, because you can celebrate the things that you really think are good examples of, and the good stories that really are illustrating what you're trying to do.
That storytelling seems so important nowadays too, because it's how you, and again we come back to this connection. It's what helps external people in the market be able to connect. Any company should have sort of a face or brand, or somebody that they can connect with, versus just and I mean that's big on the branding of course as well, but I think we're looking for more personalized stories now. And it's shifting in the markability.
Absolutely. I had this interesting conversation yesterday with some super entrepreneurs, and they were telling their stories about their can I talk about this just 2 minutes, because it's really interesting, I think. 3 entrepreneurs, really interesting companies. They were all presenting their companies to a group of people, where I was one of them, and they were presenting one challenge each by the end of the presentations for the group to discuss and try to help them. And all the 3 companies had challenges regarding regulatory issues. And it was so funny to see how the group discussed around this. It was a lawyer there, so you can imagine how the discussion came out. But it was so much about logic. But this is so good for this, it's so good for that. But it's not only about logic, and that I think so many people forget that, because you also have to appeal to people's emotions. Decisions are not based on logic only. You need logic. But you also need to appeal to people's emotions. And that's why storytelling becomes so interesting. Because that's a way of communicating the logic, the facts, in a way that you really remembers, and
you feel the heart.
Exactly.
You go right
exactly. Exactly. And so I think it's also storytelling towards regulators. I mean, they're not only basing their decisions on logic either, because they're also humans. So we came into a very interesting discussion about how they need to find the stories, also for communicating to decision makers and regulators.
What would you say are the risks of faking the purpose or the emotional branding of a company?
Well, we talked about trust. It's something you build long term. It takes a long time to create a trusted brand. And faking, I mean, sooner or later, people will see that you're faking. It's impossible. You can't do it. And I mean, it's a huge risk when people realize that it's not authentic. So it's absolutely not working, and even less today than before social media and the speed of communication.
Yeah, we talk about this actually in Engage, where you can't control the conversation anymore.
Exactly.
You can only contribute to it and be a part of it, and maybe try and direct it in a certain way, but there's no way you can be in control of it anymore. It's not possible.
But that was possible like 25 years ago. You could control your messages. You can't anymore.
Exactly. Huh. So, when a company is going through change or some sort of issue or something, what would you say the best ways for them to communicate?
Well, people tend not to like change because they become afraid. I know what I have. I don't know what's going to happen. I don't like change. So that is why it's so important to have a really solid message platform when you communicate change, so that you have the messages very, very clear about why you're doing this. And I mean, if it's something difficult for some people in the organization, it's so important to make sure that people understand why you have to do this, because you have to raise your eyes, and you have to look at the corporate purpose. If this is what we're going to do, this is what we're going to achieve, then we have to do certain changes in order to achieve that purpose. So coming back to the purpose, but explain the why, and do that in a very strategic and organized way.
So what do you see as the biggest challenges for companies going into, say, the next 2 to 5 years or into the future?
Well, I would say it's attracting the right people. Because it's all about creativity, innovation, being able to change at least as quickly as the environment is changing. And in order to do that, you really need engaged employees.
What about the biggest opportunities for companies?
The ones that realizes how you attract these people. You need to get people engaged in what you're doing. I think corporate purpose is key, even there. To be able to communicate that and make that seem interesting and important.
Do you find that leaders understand the importance of communication?
It's improving. Not everyone, but it has changed quite drastically, I would say, since I started in this field, which is like 20 years ago. I mean, if you look at management teams, now almost every head of communications is part of the management team. They were not some years ago. Public affairs used to be lawyers. Today we see more and more communicators being head of public affairs. So I think the importance of communication is really increasing, and managers are realizing that.
Yeah, I'm seeing a bit of a shift where what was considered the softer sides of business, where it's marketing, communications, HR, they're actually realizing that they can be very strong strategic partners for CEOs and leaders of companies as well, much more so than before. I think the challenge for people in those positions is to communicate their value in a sense that the more linear thinkers can relate to, you know, if it comes to the numbers or the figures or whatever.
Exactly.
But I think, you know...
And you need both.
Yes, exactly. It's almost like this balance between, you know, the head and the heart again, and making sure that they find the right connection there so that it's good for the whole organization, the whole company.
Exactly. And I also think we've seen some companies really having hard times and losing trust. So I think that's also quite a scaring examples that make managers realize that I don't want to be there where they are. So that's also a way of...
So what I mean, in those types of situations, which we have seen a lot, what would you say employees or people working at the company, what can they do to minimize the fear there if a company has lost its trust because, say, one rogue, you know, incident that was taken totally out of context or whatever happened? What can they do to rebuild the trust and feel better about being there?
Yeah, no, it's really about taking action and showing people, both employees and other stakeholders, that we have realized something went terribly wrong and we've done everything to make sure this will never happen again. So really action-oriented and communicating what you're doing to prevent things like this happening again. But you also need, I mean, it's not, I think managers need help. They realize they need help to communicate in the right way. All the changes we're doing, how do we communicate them, and to whom, and who do they speak to, and but it's really action, and it's not a quick fix.
Well, there's certainly, we could probably go on for hours here,
yeah,
talking about all these different types of things. But you know, I think there's a lot of challenges that companies are facing right now, especially with their employees and you know, the communication angle of it. And I think, you know, a lot of what you were saying, building the trust, finding the purpose, getting people, you know, working together, and finding the ways that you can communicate exactly what you're doing and why you're doing it are going to be essential moving into the future.
Absolutely.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much for coming, Petra. I appreciate your time, and you know, we appreciate being able to kind of crawl into your little brain here.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm so glad I could come.
Well, thank you so much again.